Good morning and welcome to the Atlantic Council. It's great to welcome those in person and also those watching live via ACTV for this timely conversation on why our closest neighbors in Central America matter so deeply for U.S. economic security and long-term growth. I'm Jason Barczyk, Vice President Senior Director here at the Atlantic Council's Adrian Arsht Latin America Center, and I'm pleased to be joined here on stage by Christy Palacia, Antonio Ortiz Mena, and we will also be joined via video in a moment by Juan Sebastian Chamorro, and this panel will be moderated by Enrique Mejia, who will introduce our speakers more formally in a moment. But first, some context. We meet at a moment of both uncertainty and opportunity. And the United States debates around affordability, our reshaping tariff policy, and the recent trade announcement with Guatemala and El Salvador, they underscore the role that our Central American partners can play in supplying essential goods at competitive prices. These agreements reflect a growing recognition that sourcing from nearby reliable partners is absolutely central to economic security. At the same time, rising pressure on Nicaragua highlights how U.S. trade policy interests intersect with the struggle for democracy in a country where basic political and economic freedoms have been just completely dismantled. All of this makes a fresh look at CAFTA-DR essential. The agreement anchors one of the most strategically important regions for the United States, enabling deep value chains, integration across apparel, agriculture, electronics, and services. The trade landscape, however, has changed dramatically since CAFTA-DR entered into force nearly 20 years ago. Digital commerce now drives an ever larger share of global trade. Supply chains have become more complex. Labor and environmental enforcement frameworks have evolved, and geopolitical competition has also accelerated. This is why today we are launching a new issue brief by Enrique Mejia, Antonio Ortiz Mena, who are here on stage, as well as Rocio Rivera Baradas, called Why Modernizing CAFTA-DR Matters for the United States and Options for Updating the Trade Pact. This publication is part of our broader America's Economic Security Group. This is a multi-sector coalition generously supported by partners here in attendance today, which advances a hemispheric vision of mutually beneficial economic security that makes the United States stronger and that makes Central America and the Dominican Republic more prosperous at the same time. Now, I'm going to take a few minutes and just share a snapshot of what is being released today, although really I encourage you to read the full publication. It's actually not too long. Read the full publication. The message of our analysis is straightforward. Modernizing CAFTA-DR is not just a technical update. It is a strategic investment in U.S. competitiveness, supply chain resilience, and the stability of a region whose prosperity directly affects our own. The brief highlights how Central America can help diversify U.S. sourcing, shorten supply chains, strengthen resilience in sectors ranging from textiles and medical devices to electronics and agricultural goods. It also underscores the untapped potential for small and medium-sized enterprises to benefit from regional integration. And it does so by laying out three realistic pathways for modernization. The first is the potential accession of CAFTA-DR members to the USMCA, which would align the region with the most modern, high-standard rules on digital trade, labor, environment, and rules of origin. The second path involves pursuing bilateral agreements with individual CAFTA-DR countries, an approach that has gained attention following the recent U.S. announcements just this past week with Guatemala and with El Salvador. The third path, and the most politically feasible in the near term, is targeted updates to specific CAFTA-DR chapters focusing on digital rules, customs facilitation, labor and environmental enforcement, investment screening, and supply chain governance. Each option presents benefits and political considerations, really especially in light of the recently imposed reciprocal tariffs, enforcement challenges across the region, and the ongoing Section 301 investigation related to Nicaragua. The report also notes the risk that in the absence of modernization, external actors will continue to gain influence in the CAFTA-DR countries. That's really important. One conclusion stands out: doing nothing is not an option. Updating CAFTA-DR would help Central American partners attract higher quality investment, integrate more deeply into North American supply chains, expand SME participation, and build more resilient and inclusive economies. So ultimately, this is about ensuring that CAFTA-DR is fit for purpose for the next 20 years. It's about aligning the agreement with the needs of today's economy and the strategic imperatives of tomorrow. And it's about recognizing that a more prosperous and connected Central America is directly in the national interest of the United States. So with that, thank you for listening to my brief overview of the report. Again, I encourage you to read it in full. But with that, let me turn it over to our Senior Fellow for Economic Development, Enrique Mejia, and one of the authors to get us started with today's conversation. Over to you, Enrique.
Thank you, Jason, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's event. I am very delighted to being here moderating this panel with very distinguished people that are part of our programming here at the Adrian Arce Latin America Center. Please allow me to start introducing Christy Pelequia. She is the founder and principal of Pelequia International, and Christy is also the member of the Atlantic Council America's Economic Security Group. That is the group that feeds the issue brief that today we're launching. Besides that, Christy is also a member of the Atlantic Council U.S.-Colombia Advisory Group. I'm very honored also to be here with my colleague Antonio Ortiz Mena. Antonio is a non-resident senior fellow of the Adrian Arce Latin America Center, focusing on trade and investment issues, particularly the USMCA. Antonio was a former diplomat of the Mexican government. He was part of the negotiation team of NAFTA and also an advisor during the USMCA negotiations. And he is currently the CEO and founder of AOM Advisors. And I have the honor also to introduce you virtually to Juan Sebastián Chamorro, who is currently based in New Orleans, Louisiana. Juan Sebastián is originally from Nicaragua. He served as Deputy Minister of Finance and Public Credit under Enriquez Bolaños' administration back in 2002 and 2006. He was also a former presidential candidate of Nicaragua back in 2021, and he is currently enrolled with Tulane University as a senior scholar. So to start today's conversation, let me start with a couple of housekeeping procedures. For those viewers online, you are able to ask questions to our panelists using askac.org. And for people here in the audience, you can do the same thing. Or at the end, we can allow some time for in-person questions in the room. So let's start breaking the ice here. So I will start with a general question for the three of us, or the three of you, I'm sorry. Let's start with you, Christy. And certainly CAFTA-DR needs modernization. It is a trade pact that was negotiated more than 20 years ago. And Jason mentioned several things, including e-commerce and other disciplines that needs updated. But I would like to hear from you, what are the main areas of the CAFTA-DR agreement that could be modernized to support trade and investment within the region? And after you, I would like to hear from Antonio and then from Juan Sebastián.
Okay, thank you so much, Enrique, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for inviting me to be here today. This is a topic that's very important. How do we work on a more integrated fashion with Latin America and Central America in particular? So I propose three main areas. The first is, I think that to be better aligned with the U.S. government, U.S. administration, trade agreements should include a framework that highlights specific areas of focus that are mutually beneficial to the United States and to the countries, that can allow the U.S. to shift production away from China, and that can bring investment back to the United States. You know, what we see with our clients, what I saw when I was with the government, and Juan Sebastián and Antonio and I were, and Enrique were talking about this before, you know, China's everywhere. And in Central America, we're still actually the top trading partner in the region. And so unlike, you know, in South America, where China's the top partner, I think we really need to do our best to leverage that. I think a framework is very important, and we saw this in the agreements that just came out last week, right? Strategic direction, which helps the public, direct the public and the private sector alike, which can allow for tangible results. I think it's worth noting that before the current Trump administration, the last trade agreement that was done with Latin America was done in 2011 with Panama. So we're really playing catch up. China's made a ton of advances in the region, and we're playing catch up. I think number two, with respect to China, we need to evaluate what their strengths are in the region and use the trade agreements as a starting point for leverage to limit China's advances in the region. They've already made BRI agreements with over 21, I think it's 22 now, countries since 2017. So, they've done a lot in a short period of time. I think we can do it as well. And I would add that I think Taiwan should play a complementary role to any agreement that we have. And then the last area is that I think any trade agreement should promote, facilitate, and require improvements to legal frameworks for business transactions and improvements to the rule of law. This will create more certainty and, as a result, more private sector investment. And if you think about, who's investing in the region, right? You look at the large U.S. investors, private equity firms. They're not focused on the region for several reasons. The countries and the opportunities are too small. It's a relatively risky region, and you can get similar returns by investing in the U.S. middle market, which is much less risky. And while there are a few funds focused on this part of the world, they cap out at about $250 million, which is really insufficient for the type of trade development that we want to see happening and integration that we want to see with the United States.
Thank you, Christy. Antonio.
Yes, great to be here. I would focus on three basic issues first. Again, starting with China, the elephant in the room. Most of South America, except for Colombia and Ecuador, now have China as their main trade partner. So what do we have remaining? We have Central America and Mexico that still have the U.S. as their main trade partner. And I think it's in the security and prosperity interests of the United States to make sure this stays the case and to increase trade and investment with South American countries. That's not part of our discussion today, but that's a big picture. So Central America is very important in this regard. Let me start with investment. I think that CAFTA-DR can be updated regarding investment, especially investment screening. Secondly, how to protect investor interests. Investor-state dispute settlement has become very controversial and at the same time pretty ineffectual. Seems that nobody likes it. Private companies think it takes a long time to resolve matters. Governments are not sure that they like ISDS. So yes, how do you protect investment in a way that is actually very effective? So investment is very important. On the trade part, I think we can think about modernizing, adjusting some rules of origin to make sure that more inputs from the region are used as, we try and detach from China. And as a complement to rules of origin of the supply chain, I think that trade facilitation sometimes gets less attention than this deserves. Everything's about tariffs, but sometimes non-tariff barriers, including customs obstacles, create a very, very big barrier to both investment and intra-regional trade and export from the region. So I would really double down on customs cooperation and trade facilitation. The third area has to do with trade and services. Just as we obsess with tariffs, we also sometimes tend to forget about non-tariff barriers, and we also obsess about trading goods, and we don't provide as much attention, I think, as we should to trade and services. In the report, we make a big deal about trade and services, the need to facilitate digital trade, to deal with data localization required and things like that. I think there's a huge potential for Central American countries to receive more investment for trade in services. So I think that's the third area. And to close off again with the big picture, CAFTA-DR exports to the U.S. account for approximately 1% of U.S. imports. So it's very important for CAFTA-DR. In the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge deal for the U.S. And by the U.S. facilitating more exports from CAFTA-DR that could have a huge security and economic impact in Central America. And in terms of the U.S., we're talking about very modest magnitudes. I think this should be eminently doable.
Thank you, Antonio. Over to you, Juan Sebastián.
Thank you very much, Enrique. And first of all, a word of gratitude. I want to thank the Atlantic Council for hosting an event for my wife, Berta Valle, 5 weeks after my arbitrary detention. This is in 2021. For Victoria, it was her first international event, which started a worldwide campaign that led to my release and the release of 221 other political prisoners. So thank you very much for the support back then and now. I think the current discussion regarding Nicaragua and CAFTA is about suspension rather than modernization at this moment, unfortunately. Maybe this is a good opportunity to illustrate that in addition of enhancing trade and promoting development, agreements such as CAFTA should promote and defend the principles of the liberal democracy. Because, as Christy just said, it is good for business as well. The case of Nicaragua, unfortunately, we have a very peculiar situation that a political party, the Sandinistas, which back then opposed the treaty, has benefited from it. The problem is not that. The problem is that Ortega has dismantled democracy, has dismantled the separation of power, has dismantled transparency, accountability, and the rule of law. This message, this example gives an entire region a very mixed and contradictory message that you can oppose the democratic system and still benefit from trade privileges. The incentives should be aligned to promote democracy, not the other way around. And in that way, and promoting, for example, rule of law would be good for businesses. Treaties should not be silent about these fundamental issues, such as human rights, civil rights. If we want a unified region, Central America, North America, led by the strongest economy in the world, this unity must be also in the forms of the ideals over which our countries, our nations have been founded. It doesn't make any sense to offer a privileged position to countries that are precisely against these foundations, the foundations of Western value, while at the same time other democracies are being denied of these trade privileges. So I think in a larger sense, the regime, my country, the Ortega Murillo regime, has not only benefited from CAFTA, but is also allowing adversaries of Western values to take advantage of such treaty. That's kind of the political perspective that I want to introduce. But also, I think being CAFTA almost 2 decades old, should be modernized in many aspects. And I think the USMCA treaty is a good example of the areas that should be revisited. Labor standards, intellectual property, artificial intelligence, e-commerce, rules of origins, as Antonio was mentioning, is crucial here, particularly important as China has significantly increased its presence in Central America. But more than technical revision, which is needed, I think, and the data that Antonio showed at the end, that this is only representing 1%, can shed light into the importance of relaunching the agreement in a way that creates a second wave of transformation that make the region, and when I say the region, not only North America, but the CAFTA, RD region, more prosperous and more secure, being so close and still very attached economically, culturally, politically, and socially to the U.S. So I think this modernizing of the treaty should take into the consideration more strategic elements in integrating the economy in this what I would call a second wave of the treaty, because as Antonio showed in the data, told us in the data, there's still so many things to make a more integrated region. I'm talking about Central America and North America in terms of economic investment, trade, and definitely modernizing the treaty should be a step forward to achieve those goals.
Thank you, Juan Sebastian. Well, what we are learning today from the three of you is that certainly modernizing CAFTA-DR is not a matter of updating trade agreement or trade disciplines. It's something related with competition power, the role that the U.S. should play on that, but it's also preserving the rule of law and preserving the opportunity that the private sector can invest to create more jobs in the region. In that sense, Antonio, the Trump administration has changed the traditional approach to trade agreements. Now is more based on fair trade or reciprocal trade and also preserving U.S. national interests. What do you think are the missed opportunities for Central America to contribute to the U.S. economic security?
Well, I think that Central America, CAFTA-DR, have a key role to play here. Number one, food security. As the U.S. Wants to increase its food security and import mostly from trusted partners, Central America can play a key role. And even with the new tariff policy pursued by the current U.S. administration, you have seen that some tariffs have come down on products that are not produced in the U.S. I still have not heard a lot from the U.S. coffee producers lobby. I haven't heard a lot from the U.S. banana producers lobby. So there's a great complementarity, right? In terms not only of prices, to lower the price of staple goods, but also to ensure supply of goods that the U.S. needs. And it's not producing, nor will it produce. For me, that's almost like a no-brainer. Secondly, mineral resources. People talk about South American countries about that, but there are also important mineral resources in several Central American countries. So I think that's a second opportunity. And in terms of U.S. investment, the U.S. also wants to increase investments in a way that those investments do not compete with potential investments in the U.S., not zero. So again, trade and services and investments in digital commerce, etc. I think that together, Central America and the DR are quite an important market that is not to be dismissed at all. So for U.S. exports of services, I think that's a win-win. And I think with that, you cover both security concerns and trade balance and fair investment opportunities too. I really think, again, that this is a way to start rebuilding the new trade system, like Lego by Lego, little by little. I think this is one very easy piece to connect.
Thank you, Antonio. Christy, let me get back to the China angle here. Traditionally, CAFTA-DR countries are recipients of U.S. foreign direct investment. The U.S. is by far one of the most important FDI providers in the region. However, our analysis here at the center shows that the U.S. probably is not investing on what is strategic for the region and strategic for the U.S. In that sense, how can Central America play a greater role in U.S. reindustrialization, and what are the obstacles on the ground that you see for achieving this goal?
Thank you. So a few things. I think first, Central America and the DR's proximity to the United States and to Mexico, right, is a huge advantage to nearshoring as we think about redoing trade and redoing our supply chain. So a regionally integrated approach within the region and working with the U.S. will allow these countries to provide a more competitive alternative to China. Then when we look at specific sectors, I'll be brief because I agree with everything Antonio said. 100% agree on food security. I mean, Brazil, the breadbasket, right, of the cornucopia, whatever you want to call them, China is in bed with them, right? And they're their number one trading partner. And we were in Miami 2 months ago at the port. Agricultural products from Central America are among the top products being imported in that port. We need to make sure we don't lose that. And then on mining and mineral processing, I would just add to that, Antonio. I think we need to figure out how to work with these countries in Central America. Granted, there are a lot of critical minerals that are in South America, but you still have copper, nickel, zinc being available in Central America, and I think we need to collaborate on investing and processing those minerals jointly. And then, about the specific types of FDI, when you look at the sources, you really have two buckets, right? You have your financial investors, and they're focused on the risk-return profile. So is the return sufficient for the risk? And when you consider the geopolitical risk associated with these countries, the returns are often too great to justify the investment, like the economics just don't work, or the risk is too high that the return is insufficient. So as a result, U.S. investment doesn't necessarily happen, to your question, Enrique. So how can the Trump administration get investors, interested in the region? I think for strategic investors, I'm sorry, I skipped the strategic investors, such as the companies. So they're looking at things like strategic fit, vertical integration. The Trump administration can help for strategic investors, creating incentives for them to collaborate on production within the bilateral countries, and as well as in a more regional approach. We saw that in the Guatemala announcement that came out last week. You actually have a Guatemalan company investing in a very large beverage company here in the U.S., $1.4 billion. For financial investors, I think there's a lot that the U.S. can do in working in conjunction with the countries. We mentioned legal frameworks, those are essential. And I think the U.S. can de-risk projects to help balance the risk-return calculus so that U.S. investors can enter. I think I would say lastly, two things. One, the DFC, through its reauthorization, I know we're going to talk about this, but I think in the near term, they're going to have an expanded equity capability. And they could be, they could start investing as a way to bring in other U.S. investors into the region as some of these items, as a way to de-risk, and as some of these items are being worked out. And then I think in a way, national security and the investment in the region can be approached in a way that ESG was. If we look back a few years ago, investors they had a strategy for ESG, even though it didn't necessarily offer the same returns. There were a lot of benefits to funds and investors thinking about ESG. So how can national security become the new ESG, where you actually have investors that have it and private equity firms that have it as an investment strategy? And if we're strategic around how these arrangements are set up and how these trade agreements are set up, we don't have to sacrifice the financial returns.
Thank you, Christy, thank you, Antonio. Juan Sebastián, over to you again to talk about Nicaragua. As many of you know, the United States Trade Representative decided to start an investigation under Section 301 of U.S. Trade Act of 1974 to review Nicaragua's bad behavior on labor rights, human rights, fundamental freedoms, and rule of law. I have to say that probably this is the first time in 20 or 25 years that the USTR decided to start a 301 section investigation not to address trade barriers or digital economic exchanges. In this sense, Juan Sebastián, what's to become of Nicaragua's following a USTR report that found that democracy is in peril, that human rights are in peril, and fundamental freedoms and the dismantling of rule of law are persistent?
Well, I think first, Enrique, it's important to note that Section 301 is being applied mainly due to the consistent violation of human rights, civil rights, but also labor rights in Nicaragua, as well as economic rights, not only to Nicaraguan businesses, but also to U.S. investors and U.S. citizens. And that's the reason why there is a 301 investigation in the first place. American companies have been expropriated, confiscated, and their properties invaded by paramilitaries. In the evidence collection phase of the 301 process, Early this year, a panel of experts from different agencies of the U.S. Federal government listened to testimonies of the victims. There were several of them were Americans. These included, for example, Mountain Gateway, a U.S. religious organization with some businesses in Nicaragua that suffered tax extortion, confiscation, and imprisonment of its leadership. And more recently, this is outside the 301 process, but it has been known that BHMB Mining Company, the Nicaraguan gold processor of a Florida-based company whose closure and license were revoked by the Ortega Murillo regime, along with the seizures of all the equipment, inventory, and other company assets, are just two examples of the violations of economic rights that investors, not only Nicaraguans, but also American investors are suffering in Nicaragua right now. So it's obvious that the 301 investigation is taking particularly attention to that. Michael Healy, my cellmate in prison, was basically an American citizen, was in prison just because he was president of COSEP, the main business umbrella organization. The Nicaraguan American Chamber of Commerce was dissolved arbitrarily. Its leadership had to go into exile, and AmCham's properties were confiscated. This is a direct attack of the of partners of the U.S. in Nicaragua. So the 301 panel noticed also that labor rights were being violated in addition to rights of investors. There are no unions. There's no independent union movement in Nicaragua. All the unions are controlled by the regime. So the panel already concluded that without real bargaining power, labor in Nicaragua is weak. And that creates an unequal position with respect to American workers, and therefore generating an unequal condition to compete, and as a result of an unfair situation for American workers. So we're talking about some form of, in addition to violations of rights, we're talking about some violations of the treaty itself in terms of the economics of it. Politically, also, I have to mention that the Nicaraguan regime has consistently and for decades sided with Russia, with China, with Iran and North Korea politically. And this obviously poses a serious threat to the region and to Western values. Just last Monday, the Department of State revoked visas to several individuals, including owners, executives, senior officials, transportation companies, travel agencies, or those who were providing services to assist migrants intending to illegally enter to the United States. So Ortega has not only been an adversary of the U.S. for decades, but also is a promoter of direct attacks against its national security of the U.S., I mean, by organizing and profiting from smuggling networks that had brought approximately 500,000 people into the U.S. in the last three years. So yes, it is true that this 301 investigation is the first time that it mentions human rights, civil rights violations, but also has a very important components of the treaty itself, in particularly rule of law, the defense of investors in the country, things that are, as we know, extremely important for a country to attract investment, and labor rights as well.
Thank you, Juan Sebastián. Antonio, back to you. You are a survivor of many trade battles in the past.
Yeah, I have a lot of scars.
Yeah. You had the opportunity to be one of the negotiators from the Mexican government team during NAFTA. How can CAFTA-DR countries learn from USMCA current framework to promote supply chain resilience, and specifically how to learn from that competitiveness gains that Mexico has acquired from USMCA in critical goods and services?
Yes, Enrique, I would say that it's very important to keep a focus on certainty. So the name of the game is to create certainty for trade and to investment. Ideally, it's to have zero tariffs, but that's not the main aim. The aim is to create certainty. In fact, I know that if there's a trade-off between tariff levels and uncertainty levels, some companies would rather pay a low-level tariff if they have certainty that there will be no bad surprises, as opposed to saying, yes, in theory it's zero, but there are a lot of unilateral actions that might hamper access. So for me, that is the lesson. Number one, that lesson was prevalent during the original NAFTA negotiations. That was a key aim for the USMCA, for the NAFTA renegotiation that led to the USMCA. In fact, in the USMCA, there's an annex that deals with potential Section 232 actions by the US. And Mexico has the right to export a certain number of cars and pickup trucks, right? So it's all about certainty. So for me, that is the key lesson. Once you have a certain level of certainty, then you can, invest to see how you can have the most resilient, the most effective supply chain. And that being said, I think it would be economically not costly for the U.S. to try and reduce the level of uncertainty regarding anti-dumping and countervailing measures against Central American ag exports. Of course, there should be fair trade, but sometimes these AD, CVD actions just create a whole lot of uncertainty and make it very difficult for the U.S. or other countries to invest in Central America. So I'm completely obsessed with this uncertainty issue.
You make a great point there, Antonio. On our recent issue brief, we explained that there are 3 scenarios available for CAFTA-DR modernization, and one is the accession to USMCA. Do you think this is viable? This is something that can be done? And I have to mention, like 2 or 3 years ago, the Costa Rican government raised their hands and let the USTR and the Mexican and Canadian counterparts that they were ready to accede USMCA.
Honestly, I think it's not viable. I'm no longer a diplomat. I can, speak my mind. I think it's not viable for both technical reasons, the accumulation of origin. It can get very complicated, and political reasons. I think it's difficult enough to think about a successful USMCA review. So adding complications to the table for me would be no, don't go there. As I say, don't go there. But there are other options. We mentioned, accession. So my personal view is don't go there. Mm-hmm. Bilateral agreements, my personal view, again, is don't go there. I think the third option that we offer here is a protocol to update CAFTA-DR with a number of items that will deal with investment concerns and with security and economic concerns. So for me, that is the way to go. And thinking about the potential benefits, we lay them out here in the paper, but I think we should also focus on the cost. If the U.S. and Central America DR don't work on this, then the U.S. is leaving the table to China, right? I think that not doing something is costly. Rather than just focusing on the benefits, I think the costs of not updating are enormous.
Thank you, Antonio. Christy, intra-regional trade in Central America is somehow cumbersome in terms of cost efficiency, even though all the countries are very near to each other, trying to creating trade via terrestrial transportation is very expensive. Mm-hmm. China has been doing an investment approach in Central America, mainly on strategic infrastructure, seaports, and certain investments on mining. If terrestrial transportation is key for intra-trade within the region and with the United States, what do you think are the possibilities that the U.S. can leverage there in terms of foreign investment?
Well, I think getting to your point about certainty, I mean, the biggest challenge with a lot of with developing infrastructure projects and roads and other ports that would be needed to facilitate trade, certainty and rule of law is probably the biggest barrier. And so I think these agreements really need to address that and need to hold the countries accountable to making changes. I think some of the other barriers are really the process of having these projects become investable, right? If you look at Guatemala, we basically assumed when I was at the DFC and OPIC, infrastructure was not going to happen in Guatemala, right? So let's just look at the other sectors if we actually want to get something done, because it takes forever for infrastructure, public-private projects to get through Congress. So that's something that needs to be addressed. I think when we look at some of the other barriers in terms of the projects being bankable, right, that's an area that we really need to focus on. How do we make sure that these projects have the right structure so that the private sector is able to come in? Because if they don't, then China's going to bank them. We've seen that in Ecuador. We had a whole renewable energy stream of projects that we wanted to finance, but they weren't bankable. China financed all of them. And so we need to get ahead of that. And so I think some of the ways that we can help that is, number one, mitigating construction risk, right? De-risking things like currency risk. Then we've talked about that a lot. Obviously, mitigating political risk and the uncertainty around that. I think there are various tools within the U.S. government. I mean, you have the DFC, and that can serve to de-risk the projects so that the private sector could come in alongside of the U.S. government, because the U.S. government doesn't have sufficient funding to do it on its own. I think when we look at sort of the near term, and what do we do while these projects are getting to the point where they're ready, right? Because these things are going to take time. I think we could partner with allied countries that do this well, right? Countries like Korea, countries like Australia, that are exceedingly good in infrastructure and mining, and that could play a role. I think that Treasury's Office of Technical Assistance can help make the projects bankable. And I also think that we should be leaning on our development banks, where we have the largest investment, like the IDB, the IFC. We should be directing them to do the technical assistance to help make these projects bankable for the private sector, because the uncertainty, the not having the right cash flows, if there's uncertainty around the cash flows, if there's uncertainty around the risk, the financing is not going to be there, and therefore the projects are not going to be built.
I completely agree with you, Christy, and I have to say that early this year here at the center, we published an issue brief about DFC reauthorization, and one of the suggestions we made is that DFC should be more active partnering with CAF or IDB Invest, taking into account that those development banks have offices in all the countries in Latin America, and they're able to connect with local stakeholders. So I think that's crucial.
And when I was at the DFC, actually, we made, the partnership with the IDB has had many iterations, right? We announced a $10 billion partnership with them back at their 60th anniversary in 2019. And there's a lot of work that went into what are the specific areas where we can partner. I think your point about them being present, I think they have a presence in all of the countries, and I think we need to think about where does the capital come from, and what are the core competencies that the IDB and CAF have. And one of the, technical assistance is something that they do well. And through their public sector arm, as well as, in the private sector arm. And I agree. I think we need to lean on that.
Thank you. Juan Sebastián, let's go back to Nicaragua and let's talk about possible scenarios. Today is the due date of the investigation of 301. USTR will make an announcement within 30 days. It is completely certain that a potential decision of imposing trade sanctions to Nicaragua will create ripple effects in the region. In your opinion, what are the short-term and long-term impacts, not only for Nicaraguan businesses, but also for U.S. imports and for regional supply chains? I was reading this morning that in the case of Costa Rica, it's critical taking into account that Costa Rica relies heavily in Nicaraguan inputs for many things, including products needed for food security.
Well, I think to start with, it is the Ortega Murillo regime, the one imposing sanctions on the Nicaraguan people. And let me explain this in more detail, because as a result of the escalating repression that includes assassination, disappearance, prison, torture, forced exile, stripping the nationality, among other violations, more than 700,000 people, more than 12% of the population have left the country since 2018. So this is a catastrophe. Thousands of businesses have been closed, and many more are under constant tax extortion and confiscations. The doing business index has deteriorated more than in any other country in the region, perhaps even worse than in Venezuela. And according to the so-called new constitution, the judiciary is no longer an independent branch of government. So Ortega has destroyed the rule of law. So when we talk about imposing costs on people, Ortega is the most responsible of doing that. And by doing this, Ortega and Murillo has compromised the already affecting the development path, the future development path of the country, and the destinies of generations to come. So the cost of that is extremely high. Now, by endangering CAFTA, Ortega Murillo's basically what the 301 investigation is recommending suspending trade benefits, and the consequences of this will be considerable, to say the least. Nicaragua has benefited a lot from the treaty, expanding export base for almost 8 times since entering into force in 2006. The United States right now is the destiny of 55% of the country's total exports. Nicaragua has never been so dependent on exports in their economic history. Today, 36% of GDP are exports. So we're talking about an economy that is extremely exposed to international trade. My own calculations, considering different alternatives, because there are 4 options on the table right now, but according to the, an analysis of the different effects, my own calculations indicate that a suspension of CAFTA will represent, on average, about 5 points of GDP, or for the first 2 years, or $1.5 billion per year during the first 2 or 3 years, and then the economy will eventually recover. This is a considerable amount of money, considering the small scale of the Nicaraguan economy. Free trade zones will be the most heavily affected, of course, but businesses could, and going to your question about the ripple effects in other countries, some businesses will be able to move orders from the Nicaraguan plants to Honduran and Dominican Republic plants to supply the global markets, for example. Even if exports can find new destinations, especially agricultural goods, the transition will have lasting effect in the economy due to the severity of the shock, which is considerable. And workers will be the most affected, according to my calculations. For business owners, I have to say that business has always been, forever, a very risky operation. The think tank that I directed back in 2017 issued several studies indicating of the risk that Ortega imposed on the economy. So business owners cannot deny the knowledge of the risk of their investment, of investing in Nicaragua. Despite the enormous export potential, Nicaragua had, since Ortega came into power in 2007, significant political risks that are now being materialized through the potential closure of markets due, as I say, and I want to reiterate, due to a repressive regime that not only has violated human rights, but economic and labor rights as well.
Thank you, Juan Sebastian. We're almost running out of time, and I have an additional question for each one of you, and then I have some questions from the audience. So let's start with a very quick question for you, Christy. The U.S. has like 2 available tools to leverage investment, U.S. investment, and enhance U.S. economic security in Central America. The first one is obviously the DFC reauthorization, and the second one is the approval in Congress of the Americas Act. Do you think that these two tools will create the conditions to enhance a region role on U.S. reindustrialization?
I think it's a start. I think that, if you look at the DFC and the reauthorization, I think a focus on economic security is critical. I think a focus is critical, right? The second is the DFC, when it was created, there was a focus on in the BUILD Act on low-income and lower middle-income countries. Anyone who's heard me talk about the DFC is sick of hearing this, but the Western Hemisphere is an upper middle-income region and a high-income region. So I think there's enough understanding and appreciation for that should be addressed in the reauthorization as well as in the Americas Act. And so that's going to be critical. Not having confusion about what's happening will allow for investment to flow, right? The DFC sits in the middle of so many agencies, and so it's critical that everyone understands what the mandate is. More than anything else, clarity of purpose is, I think, hugely important, and I think that's going to happen. I think the equity scoring that should be addressed in the reauthorization will allow the DFC to take bigger positions that right now the private sector, for all the reasons we're talking about, haven't wanted to take on their own. And so I think that will help to bring in private sector. What do we need? We need more certainty. We need private sector investment. And I think we also need a plan with the private sector, right? I mean, thinking about how do we bring in Costa Rica into USMCA and the new USMCA. I think a lot of that has to be driven by the private sector as they think about economic security and how do we create the supply chains that take advantage of a new trade environment. I think it's got to be done in cohesion. And I think through that partnership, it can come together. And then I would also mention that I think some of these tools can be, there's the defense and the offense. China's there today. How do we use the DFC's debt as an instrument of defense when China, in projects maybe where China already has a role, but we don't want them to potentially be in a debt-to-own situation. And then in the long run, we can use the enhanced equity tools to really step up and make meaningful investments alongside the private sector.
Thank you, Christy. Antonio, when we were writing the issue brief, we had to stress the difficult situation for Central American governments about dealing with CAFTA-DR modernization at the same time with negotiating reciprocal tariffs. Right now, the U.S. government announced framework agreements with Guatemala and El Salvador. Do you think that this is the type of partnerships that can help to modernize CAFTA-DR?
No. And I'll tell you why. Because those tariffs were imposed under IEPA authority. Who knows what will happen with IEPA? And secondly, just as tariffs can be reduced as through these agreements, they can be raised again. So they don't deal with the uncertainty issue. I think rather that it is very, very important to create a more lasting framework. I see these agreements as more temporary fixes than a more lasting framework, even if they involve some tariffs. I'm going against my sort of, endangered species free trader. I still very much instinctively a free trader, but I think it's better to have some tariffs, providing a great deal of certainty. And to complement what Christy just said, it's not a matter of whether there will be investment in Central America or not. There will be. The question is who will be investing? Is it China? Is it the U.S. or allies? That is the question. So in addition to what was mentioned about DFC and equity participation, I think it's important not to forget about this and to see what role political risk insurance can play, not only MIGA, but through IDB and DFC. So the question is that investment has to flow. It's better that it flow from the U.S. and friendly countries than from other countries. Keep our eye on the ball, as they say. Keep our eye on the ball here.
Absolutely. Once again, it's about power competition. Juan Sebastián, I have a question from the audience that I think you can help us with that, given that Nicaragua has a long-standing tradition of the apparel manufacturing. Marali asked, why has apparel from CAFTA countries not been more competitive than Asian exports? What should be changed to encourage apparel production in the Western Hemisphere?
Well, I think you have to look at the different cases. Nicaragua has been very competitive. In fact, if you take a particular items like T-shirts, Nicaragua has, in several cases, been the main exporter to the U.S., competing with Bangladesh, India, and other countries. So, it's the export potential of Central America cannot be underestimated. The problem is not, I believe, a matter of competitiveness. It's a matter of creating, this is what I would call a second wave of transformation, pretty much what Costa Rica did. Costa Rica is no longer competitive in apparel, but for the basic reason that it's extremely competitive on medical appliances, for example, an item that has an immense amount of value added. So again, I've been talking more about Nicaragua, but as a general reflection, it's so sad to be out of this conversation of the modernizing or updating. But I think the real issue here, and I think there's an agreement among all of us, that China is a big competitor. China is a big problem. And Antonio is right. Whoever is going to invest, there's going to be investment in Central America. So this way of seeing China as a competitor it's okay, it's fine, but seeing Central America as a competitor I think is wrong. Central America is the best ally to North America to conform an economic entity that will compete with China overall. So the conversation must move beyond revisiting tariffs or whether or not the products compete with U.S. production, but rather to establish a strategic position, strategic policy of economic growth, region investment, and so on in the region to compete with China and other economies.
Thank you, Juan Sebastián. I think we have three main conclusions from today's panel. The first one is that modernizing trade agreements in the Western Hemisphere is a matter of national and economic security for the U.S. is important for strengthening the position of the U.S. in the world, especially when you're talking about power competition with China. The second one is that trade disciplines needs to be updated to be just following the pace of the new realities of the economy, particularly e-commerce, customs facilitation, customs modernization. And third, this is something that relies not only in the US, but also in Central America. That's why we have public policy recommendations for the US government, for the Central American governments, and for the private sector. I want to invite you to read our issue brief outside of the room. In our lobby, you can find screens where you can find a QR code so you can download our report. I want to thank Cristi, Antonio, and Juan Sebastián for joining us, and I want to thank you all for being here today. And thank you very much, and have a nice day.